Gaza, Zionism, and synthesis. The horror of Gaza is indefensible. Intuitively, it is stomach-turning. It's an atrocity. For most, it is evil incarnate, unimaginable evil. The perpetrator is, first of all, Zionism. Israel itself must decide of what its attitude is to be towards Zionism. But as an American, I'm concerned about America's descent, because it's our president who led the parade in the bombing of so many innocent women and children especially. And it's been the American media that has championed the cause of Israel, making the people who were being murdered the victims, the guilty ones, rather than the bomb droppers. But what should be done? Value conflicts are killing people all over the world, not just in Gaza, but in the Ukraine, well, everywhere, because value conflicts exist everywhere. So what is to be done about value conflicts? Friedrich Joseph Schelling, who lived between 1775 and 1854, was an important part of a movement to handle value conflicts in a better way. James Madison in America was at about the same time doing the same thing. Madison's response was the United States Constitution, which takes differing visions, conservative and progressive, creating a two-party system in which opposites somehow or other can work towards the benefit of the nation. New and old worlds must be analyzed, evaluated, and created. Wisdom makes it possible to open the door to opposites, to differences, which must exist. Without these differences, we're dead. With the differences, what? War? Is war the only solution? Is Gaza and its eradication from the earth the only solution? Or does wisdom suggest a better solution? Transcendence is what is missing in the Gaza solution. Transcendence dominates our response to what's happening in Gaza because we simply intuitively respond with horror at the massacre of so many people. But what does transcendence mean in the face of a value conflict like that between people who are saying they want a larger Israel and people who are saying they want a place to live? How do you reconcile irreconcilable contradictions? Because they come up all the time. Well, the way most people reconcile them is by war. Whoever has most power can simply have their way. But there's a different kind of way suggested by transcendence, because transcendence exists on both sides of the opposition, both sides of the conflict. Each side has a certain orientation to transcendence that must not be ignored or lost. And each side betrays transcendence in a way that must be overcome to whatever extent overcoming it is possible. So we're talking now about a resolution of value conflicts, which is called synthesis. That's what it was called by Kant and Fichte and Schelling. Synthesis. Synthesis means a recognition that the differences are necessary. They must exist and be respected in problem solving. Thesis means both respect for the transcendence that hides on my side of the conflict and respect for the transcendence that is hidden on the other side of the conflict. Transcendence means a rejection of the betrayal of transcendence that exists on my side of the contradiction, as well as a rejection of the betrayal of transcendence that exists on the other side of the contradiction. So synthesis is based upon a recognition that our affirmations of conceptual relationships both partially express and partially betray true reality, and that this means that reform of these judgments that we make, these resolutions of value conflicts that we make, have themselves mean further reform. Synthesis creates out of warring opposites something new. This something is not a homogeneous unity. It weds opposites like husband and wife, like white and black. It weds opposites like Germany and England. It weds opposites between, as they're realized between people, between individuals. It reconciles these opposites by maintaining or persevering in its recognition of what is valid on each side of the opposition, but by a willingness to extract, to whatever extent it's possible, the betrayal of transcendence that exists on both sides of the opposition. So synthesis now is going to mean, first of all, gnosis. What is gnosis? Gnosis is an experience of the divine attraction of transcendence that is there in something. But gnosis is not enough, because both sides experience gnosis. Gnosis both recognizes the reality and betrays the reality. And so that it's necessary to reconcile conflicting gnoses. Gnosis gives us a sense of transcendence, and we couldn't do without it. On the other hand, gnosis betrays reality, and we must correct the betrayal by reconciling it with a conflicting gnosis. So the horror in Palestine has been produced in large part by a Zionist preference for the destruction of the enemy in the face of a value conflict, rather than by synthesis. The destruction of the enemy is an easier solution often enough, and certainly it's been easier for Israel in this situation, because to arrive at a solution that in which the interests of both sides are preserved, the true interests are preserved, and the false betrayals of true interests are eliminated. It's a very challenging prospect. It has been very difficult to achieve, and it has not been achieved. But what we can say is that if and when that value conflict between the people in Gaza and Israel, when and if that is going to be resolved, it will be resolved by synthesis. War does not resolve the conflict. It might put a stopper on it for a while, but the conflict will return. Synthesis, then, is the demand of transcendence. Who, then, is the enemy? Is the enemy just the other side? The enemy is, in a sense, the selfishness which refuses to open to whatever is valuable on the other side. The enemy for Catholicism, with its sense of being chosen, is not the other side, but it is the unwillingness to open to dialogue with the other side so that there can be mutual enrichment. The enemy for the Protestant who awaits the coming of Christ on the clouds so that he could sit on those clouds and look down and see others destroyed, and looks forward to this with joy. This is not being chosen truly. What being chosen means is bringing the wealth of your vision and exchanging it for the wealth of the vision of the person on the other side of the conflict. For Judaism, being chosen has got to mean an openness to synthesis. For American imperialism, it must mean a rejection of a false, totally improper desire to impose our ways upon the world, and a recognition that our ways, while right for some, may be wrong for others. There must be an ability to see and to evaluate gnosis. So we're addressing a secret of nature. This is not just something that has to do with political affairs between nations or between races. This is the secret of nature. Between opposites, there is from time to time, a coming together, a synthesis, and it is the key to evolution. Evolution in nature takes place through the relationship between opposites, which can, at a very slow pace, mean evolution. But with conscious people, evolution can be understood. Synthesis can be mastered. Synthesis can be made easier, and ultimately an evolutionary ascent towards the fuller humanity is possible. German idealism saw this. It was Friedrich Schelling who saw the possibilities of doing something with opposites that, in a sense, was there in nature, but is also there in human affairs. In the early 19th century, German idealists wanted more knowledge about an ascent towards transcendence, the very synthesis of which we speak. They wanted to know about it. But other Germans wanted to know more than that. They wanted to experience it. They wanted to become more and more, little by little, to become transcendence themselves. And this is what Franz Schubert did in his art. If Schelling wanted to give an understanding of how synthesis is possible, Schubert wanted to give an experience of it. And he took the opposites. On one hand, the opposite of a descent into the horror. And on the other, an ascent towards the sublime. And in his descent, he was so authentic that it contributed to the authenticity of the ascent to the sublime. And his art became, in a sense, something even greater than merely an understanding of synthesis. It became an experience of it. So it raised Germany and America above the stars in unique ways at the beginning of the 19th century. Was precisely their enthusiasm for doing in different ways, in different situations, synthesis, reconciling opposites by way of synthesis. This was the promised land that the Jews have been seeking, and that the Jews simply are still seeking. This was the promised land for Christianity that they have been seeking and are still seeking. We have had differing victories in the search, like that of Madison, like that of Schubert. But beyond these, there is much room for further victory over the horror of what can happen when values conflict and war is chosen as our response. We're addressing the secret of nature when we're talking about synthesis. Quantum mechanics sees in nature this core mystery of life. The mystery underlies energy creation by fusion and by fission. Fusion means a wedding of lighter nuclei, like hydrogen nuclei, that produces a reaction, a new creation. It consists of lighter nuclei, neutrons, protons, the mass of which is less than the mass of the original nuclei. But the creative power of fusion is massive. The reaction is self-sustaining. This is the reaction that powers the expansion of the universe and the creation of the stars. In opposition to fusion as an energy creator is fission, in which something is split apart. For example, the atom is split. This means a reaction that is of lesser energy and higher mass. This lesser energy, higher mass, is something less noble than fusion. Fission produces a release of energy that is indeed impressive and can be used, but is far less than the energy produced by fusion. So in this fission-fusion dichotomy, we're talking about something like the synthesis war dichotomy in human affairs. We're talking about in fission or in war, a lesser reality. Yes, it achieves something, and the achievement, however, is of lesser value than the achievement possible through synthesis or by fusion. While fission is of lesser value, it is at times useful, at times necessary. In fact, without fission, there is no access known to fusion. And fusion is of such difficulty in its access that we have not really achieved that goal yet. And yet we're seeking it because we know it is where we must go. Just as synthesis is where we must go if we are to resolve conflicts like that is giving us such horror in Gaza. So the early 19th century German idealists wanted more than simply a knowledge about fusion, a knowledge about synthesis. They wanted something better than war as a solution. They wanted something far more noble, and yet it was not theirs. They could hardly get to it until genius like Schelling's and Madison's came along and showed that perhaps, just perhaps, it is possible to recreate this world in a better problem-solving way. It is possible to make a better world a reality. So Schubert's ascent was not the same as Schelling's. Yes, many similarities, but Schelling wanted to show the possibility, conceptually, of this ascent, whereas Schubert wanted to experience it. And so he chose art as his vehicle, music as his vehicle, so that we could experience both the descent into horror. And he did this with such authenticity that it's bone-chilling. But that descent made it possible for him to make an ascent with equal authenticity to the sublime. And so therefore the synthesis was not something simply to be understood, but something that Schubert wanted to experience himself and present that experience to other people. So it raised Germany and America to the stars in a unique way 200 years ago. Gives us a possibility, a glimpse of what might be possible if only we can take synthesis and give it its reality in value conflicts like that which divide the Palestinians from the Israelis today. That value conflict is of such ugliness, and the resolution selected by Israel is of such disgusting nature that nobody can look upon what's happening there and be content with it. But to resolve it properly, we are being challenged to synthesize, to use human wisdom and bring opposites together in such a way that the true transcendence on both sides is recognized, while the betrayals of transcendence on both sides are lessened, hopefully eliminated. Why is Gnosticism important to us today? Because of gnosis. Gnosis is a kind of knowledge in which the real is experienced. It's not just known about, it's not just factual mastery, but the real is indeed experienced in its motion, in its movement from where it is towards where it ought to be. And this is the essence of gnosis. It is this knowledge of gnosis which gives to us a sense of where we're going, of where we ought to go, and what we ought to do. At the same time that it does that, we have to recognize that gnosis is not the same as a complete grasp of transcendence. Gnosis is indeed an experience of transcendental invitation, but it's an experience that is partial. And insofar as it's partial, it betrays transcendence even while expressing it. So you say, what benefit is that? Well, it's a great deal of benefit, because without gnosis, there is no experience of transcendence. With gnosis, yes, there is the necessity to go beyond the gnosis, to go beyond the knowledge, to correct it, constantly reform it. And yet there is that true grasp that is life itself to the knower. So what is the role of art here? Art is different from science. Science knows reality, that which actually is, but gnosis and the art in which gnosis finds expression experiences what actually is in the shadow or illuminated by what ought to be. And so there is a unique role for art in the human experience. Without art, the human experience is not human at all. So with this in mind, let's try to see what this actually means in society. Why be concerned about art and reality? Well, it's obvious why we're concerned about reality. Without a knowledge of reality, we have no control over it. We're simply its victims. But on the other hand, without art, we don't know what to do with our knowledge. Without art, we have no vision of what to do with oppositions, contradictions, like in religion. Without art, which senses both the betrayal and the fidelity of the knowledge to reality, to this fuller reality, without art, there is a sense that maybe our ideas are adequate as a guide for human endeavor. And so therefore in religion, our ideas about revelation are made into absolutes and imposed upon society. In sex, the ideas of one side are made into an absolute and imposed upon the other. In matters of race, the fortunes of one group are made into an absolute and imposed upon the other. And so what is the implication here? What does this mean? Not only does it mean that we've got to avoid making an absolute out of gnosis, but it means that we've got to recognize the limitation of our own gnosis and our hunger for the gnosis of others. Yes, to gain a synthesis of these opposites in every field, there must be a very, very hard task accepted of finding out how to make a productive tension out of a tension that can be otherwise quite destructive. How do you take potential enemies and make them into treasured friends? This is the question in marriage. This is the question in international relationships. It's the question in racial relationships. It's the question throughout life. Opposites constitute an irreducible reality. One is not reducible to the other. And at the same time, one needs the other. And through creative construction, these opposites can be synthesized and made productive, made beautiful. So all the time we're reaching up for something that is beyond us. This is the essence of gnosis. Gnosis is reaching for something, experiencing its beauty, or some of its beauty, experiencing its attraction, and at the same time failing to encompass that beauty completely. But it tastes it. It hungers for more, and it is the key to life. So art has a role here in society, and I have focused upon the art of Franz Schubert because here was a man who up until his early 20s had basically seen his gnosis as the beauty of the divine invitation. It's expressed in nature, it's expressed in the stars, it's expressed all through the beauties of the Austrian countryside, and he sings of it constantly. It's expressed in sexuality, and it's expressed in the love that he has for a woman. He contracts syphilis and almost dies. And then comes a very important passage in his life. And that passage is an insistence upon diving deeply into the agonies of life, not as a replacement for the enjoyment of its beauties, but rather as an associate, as a companion piece in a joint ascent towards transcendence, which exceeds the grasp both of the tragic and of the happy ascent. Schiller spoke of this when he talks about the most beautiful experience being sort of a wedding of sorrow and joy. And in a wonderful quote Theodor Adorno talks about this music of Schubert making present what seems impossible to make present, a sense of triumph over sorrow, which is recognized in its full intensity. And so, with Schubert's vision, we would like to find, at least I suggest, it's possible to find an encouragement for a life experience in society which is richer than any that we've had so far. I think John Kennedy had that vision. He had that quest for peace and that recognition that constant war is something that is intolerable. Constant war between opposites, that when we find a group of nations who think differently and who have different values, it's not right to simply go to war with them, because war then is never ending. What Kennedy suggested was the creation of a productive tension between the nations, and he tried to communicate with other national leaders, not just of friendly nations, nations at odds with us. And for this reason, perhaps, he was murdered. And so we have this reality of dealing with irreducible opposites, not through war, but through synthesis, the synthesis that was developed by Kant and then further developed by the followers of Kant and especially by Schubert. I'd like to say something about dialectics. Today, it's evident that people are searching for a metaphysical basis, a better understanding of what metaphysics really means. And in doing so, it's important to get it right. And one of the themes today that I hear is a condemnation of dialectics as a centerpiece of an ethic. And in my estimation, the dialectics are central to the ideal ethic. And so therefore, let me say a word or two concerning that. We're talking in dialectics, we're talking about a reach, our reach for reality. Reality consists in tension between transcendence and immanence. And this reality is experienced and is known about factually. In other words, there are two ways by which we know this reality of a tension between transcendence and immanence. The first of these ways is experiential. We experience the importance, the dynamic tension between transcendence as it affects immanence, calling immanence towards itself, immanence rising and falling in its relationship with transcendence. And this is not simply a fact that we affirm, it is an experience that we know in our bones. Everybody knows it. And this knowledge then is a very important constituent of the human experience. The second way of knowing is fact knowledge, fact mastery. Fact mastery is basically the way, the approach of science, and we try to affirm relationships between real things. And when we do, we test it. And when we can affirm it unconditionally, we say we know it as a fact. So this is a different thing because the experiential knowledge is a kind of identification between knower and known. Fact mastery is not. It hasn't anything to do with this identification. It's simply an establishment of the relationships or affirmations of relationships between things. So I know John in two ways. I know Mary in two ways. The first of these ways is through identification. I experience John and Mary in their hopes, their desires. I'm in some way limited, of course, united with them. And the second way I know them is I know facts about them. I know where they were born, how old they were, their brothers and sisters. But the world of facts is always an impoverishment with respect to the world of experience. Now, the world of experience has a problem, and that is that, we call this experience of reality gnosis, because we identify with the known thing in its orientation to transcendence. To some extent, we identify with their yearning for transcendence, for the good, and with their abhorrence of non-being. So this is a challenge to man to, first of all, recognize that there are two ways of knowing and that they are very different from one another, and that they must be synthesized by the wise man. Wisdom means bringing these two kinds of knowing into a unity. So reality then is one. Reality is transcendence, which is one. But reality is also paradoxically many, because immanence is many. Immanence is not one. One is not the many. Yet in the many we sense the one. This is the sort of mystery underlying the whole human experience. So the source of the world dynamic is this hidden reality of transcendence, the hidden reality of the one, which calls to the many, bringing the many, empowering the many to be more and more an image of the one. In the book of Genesis, the mankind is called to unite, to procreate, to fill the earth. The many are called by the one, the great God, to become more an image of that great God by uniting. So we're dealing with a very basic dynamic in reality here. We're dealing with reality here. And reality is, we can call it dialectical. There is a reach of the many towards the one, an imaging of the many, of the one. The dynamic comes from both the creativity of the transcendence and the hunger of the one for that transcendence. So the dialectic is a reach of many for what it cannot be. and yet at the same time can become more like that one. And here is the mystery. Paradox is everywhere. The many want to be the one, are called to be the one, and are called actually to image the one little by little throughout history. This underlies evolution. It underlies morality. This is what morality is all about. Transcendence cannot be identified with by the many. Transcendence is always transcendence, and yet it is calling man, calling the world, calling all of creation to replicate or image that transcendence in its own unique way. So the importance of the synthesis that unites immanence is absolutely central. The importance of Kant's emphasis upon synthesis as the proper conclusion of the tension between opposites is centrally important. The catastrophe of Hegel's messing around with this synthesis, with this motion towards imaging the transcendental one, is terribly important if we are seeking happiness and health, whether it be in racial relations, sexual relationships, social relationships, international relationships. It's going to be always not by a war between selections, between opposites. It's going to be by way of a synthesis of opposites. This is why the scripture puts such an important emphasis upon love. Love is a personification of synthesis. So this is why it's so important today in the reestablishment of a metaphysical vision. It's so important to recognize the role of transcendence and immanence in an understanding of reality. And it's important to recognize that dialectics defines the reach upwards towards transcendence by immanence. And in a negative way, it's important to see the catastrophe to the human event when a Marx takes the opposites and either selects between them or abolishes both in his reach for an ethic. It's important to see what a catastrophe identity politics is when it selects between opposites. It's important to see how totally the key to health is a synthesis between opposites, as challenging as that may be. Today, the topics of gnosis and Gnosticism are spoken of often, and I think it's important to get an idea of what the difference is between gnosis and Gnosticism. Gnosis is the experience of transcendental attraction, and Gnosticism is an ideology that attempts to understand the implications of this experience of attraction. So Gnosticism applies human wisdom to the experience, and in a sense, Gnosticism always distorts as well as expresses that experience. There is then a kind of knowledge which is experiential, which is intuitive, which grasps reality in its own way. It's like the difference between knowing your wife as a person, as you do know her, on one hand, and knowing your wife in terms of facts about her on the other. In one case, you have gnosis as your knowledge of your wife, and in the other case, you have ideas about your wife. The two differ. So what is the importance of this? Gnosis can and must be synthesized because it is through ideas about gnosis that we gain power to control reality. So the different ideologies that we create based upon gnosis are very important to us, and without them, we wouldn't be able to do much. But it's also important to recognize that these ideas about gnosis distort them inevitably. And it's also important to recognize that the gnosis give us a kind of knowledge of reality that the ideas, the ideologies do not do. The ideologies can tell us only about reality and do not give us that experience of it. So what we have really is a kind of knowledge that by which we identify with reality, we experience it. We experience the people that we know through gnosis. We experience our race, our racial orientation to reality through gnosis. And we experience our sexuality. We experience our nationality. We experience our religion through gnosis. And these gnosis give us an experience of the real that is really real. And at the same time, each gnosis is partial. Each gnosis then betrays the real by virtue of limiting it. So we have a kind of knowledge which is essential to us, that is gnosis. But it's also a kind of knowledge which demands an accompaniment by reason, by knowledge about, so that we do not overemphasize or overestimate the relevancy of each gnosis. Each gnosis then must be related to other gnosis. And therefore, the ethic that is experienced is one of synthesis. Now, this is very important. It's important because if you simply accept each gnosis that you have as being determinant of an ethic, you are always at war with other people and even with yourself, because as an experiencer of gnosis, you have different moments, differing experiences, and other people have differing experiences, different gnoses. So synthesis is the necessary ethic that is demanded by a valid philosophy. Now, this leaves you with a kind of dualism. Since what you experience as reality is only a partial grasp of reality, you've got to live with the fact that the way that you bring these two things together, the experience and the idea, the relationships between the gnosis, the way you bring these two things together is, in a sense, unsatisfactory. So you have Jews with one particular orientation to religion, and you have Catholics with a different one. And in a sense, the difference is to some extent inescapable. And what do you do about it? Well, you can either go to war, or you can synthesize the opposites. What do you mean by synthesize? Well, think of a relationship between man and woman. Two differing gnoses, two differing experiences of reality. And it's a challenge to actually synthesize. But when the challenge is met, the experience is marvelous, beautiful. And this basically is the paradigm that we seek, because we are involved in a universe of differing experiences of reality, each of them bringing us some unique orientation to transcendence. None of them should be simply dismissed, and yet all of them put us into a tension with the rest of the world, a tension that can either be resolved by synthesis or by war. Now, Immanuel Kant and the people who followed Kant were aware of this kind of central metaphysical challenge. What do you do with gnoses? And the Enlightenment had suggested that you deal with it by simply denying the importance of gnosis, or else you can make your own arbitrary selection between gnosis. Kant said no, that each gnosis is a sacred reality and must be respected. Herder said that each these experiences are marvelous because they attune us to the divine, each of us in our own way. And so the importance of gnosis is difficult to overestimate, impossible to overestimate. And yet at the same time, these experiences can conflict. Schubert took these conflicting experiences, for instance, the experience of the divine invitation to transcendence on one hand, and the horror of the experience of the loss of love, the loss of the one that gnosis had united, with whom gnosis had united us. And so you have these opposites, and what do you do with them? according to these men, you synthesize, and it's not an easy task, and yet it is where health and happiness lie. In contrast to this, there were philosophers like Hegel and Marx who suggested that there is possible a unity, a monolithic vision of reality in which all of these differing gnoses can be united. They can all be not just synthesized, but they can be homogenized, brought into a great unity. And that unity is going to be achieved by people like Hegel himself. He's going to find that overwhelming unity and then impose it upon the world. And Karl Marx suggested the same thing. And today we have identity politics, which suggested that we're going to arbitrarily select that unity that is going to be imposed upon everyone. So in racial matters, we choose blacks over whites. Others have chosen whites over blacks. In religion, groups choose their particular gnosis and go to war with other groups. In the matter of sexuality, it can be a magnificent thing when there is true synthesis of opposites and the opposites remain. But when one of the opposites is selected and the other rejected, there is only war. So this issue of what do you do with opposing gnoses can't be overestimated in its importance. If the answer is the answer given by Kant and by Schubert, if the answer is synthesis, in some way or other, reconciling yourself to your inability to intellectualize properly and completely the unity that is there only in transcendence, only in what is beyond our reach. If we recognize that, then we are on the way to salvation. This is what happiness and health can mean. So I would suggest, therefore, that this Kantian and post-Kantian dealing with the issue of the experience of transcendence is central. It's central to the way societies must conduct themselves. It's central to the way that the United States of America must transcend its own orientation to liberal democracy and recognize that there are alternative orientations that others prefer, and that somehow or other a synthesis must replace the single ideology that we have preached and that others have preached to us. It's time to ascend to true wisdom. Our knowledge of reality is like a pendulum. It swings, and it is called by gravity back to the center each time. But coming back to the center is with momentum that takes it to the other side. This is an important way to see reality because it relates to where we are with respect to society today. In the aftermath of the Enlightenment, we have a situation in which some people see reality only in terms of faith, beliefs often gotten from religion. The Enlightenment opened the eyes of many of us to another kind of knowledge, and that knowledge is knowledge by reason, it's science, and in this other kind of knowledge, we don't just know what our relation is to a transcendental God. We know about reality through opposites, and we try to deal with them. And some of us have determined that dealing with opposites means taking that pendulum at its extreme, or pushing it to the extreme, because there's a great deal of momentum in that swinging pendulum that pushes it towards the extreme. And you can harness that energy like you harness the energy of a brook on a mountainside, or like you harness the energy of the sun. But the problem is the people who harness the energy and pushing it to extremes often enough are so interested and focused on the extreme that they lose awareness of the other side of things. And then they are kind of renounced by that pendulum as it swings back in the opposite direction. And so there are sort of three groups in this pendulum-like swing. One group seeks the dominance of one side of the pendulum swing, and a second group seeks the dominance of the other side. But there is a smaller group, and this group is called the wise. And the wise recognizes that it is through the opposites, and at the point where those opposites are synthesized, that we actually contact reality. This is of great importance today. When we simply stress a knowledge of facts, we obtain a control over reality. It's like a knowledge of science opens up to us the secrets of nuclear science, and we are able to light a city, a country, a world with this knowledge, but we're also able to destroy the world with this knowledge. And it is the wise man who can control through wisdom the dynamics that are involved. On the other side, you have the same problem. So therefore, science is a fearsome thing. It can give power to the idiot. It can give power to the man who hates. It can give power to hatred itself. At the same time, that same science can give power to wisdom. It can give power to a balanced society. It can give power to evolution. It can hasten evolution, make us more flexible. So what is this wisdom that encompasses both sides? Well, it's the ability to recognize in opposites an invitation to transcend their separate dynamics in the creation of something new, a synthesis. The ideal, iconic expression of this is in a good marriage. Two opposites are reconciled, not destroyed, and in their reconciliation is wisdom and happiness. So therefore, what we seek today is a metaphysics that transcends the idiocy of the single pole, whether that single pole be in one direction or in its opposing direction. The single dynamic, it's recognizing the fact that there is, in reality, a pendulum-like swing between opposites, and it is through synthesizing the opposites that these poles are brought together and the dynamics are reconciled in a productive tension that recognizes the validities on both sides. How do you determine this? How do you determine what is valid on each side and what is simply an ideology without meaning? An ideology capable of destroying the world? That is a deep secret in the hearts of man, that he has this ability which can be slowly awakened to respond to true value in art, to true value in politics, to true value in religion. This true value will be the embrace of the beauties of religion on wherever you find it, an embrace of the values, true values in art wherever you find them. But it means that there must be the ability to bring the opposites together and seek an ascent through the tension between the opposites, a productive tension between the opposites. Those opposites on one hand are so powerful that they can destroy society, but on the other, they are so full of true life that they can redeem society and make them ascend towards a true image of the divine.